This story starts around the late 15th century when the European forces, the Spanish and the Portuguese, along with their African slaves who had now turned into soldiers, entered the land of Red Indians, the land we now know as America, the North and the South of America. When these Europeans entered the new land, they looted, they plundered, and they annihilated the ancient religion, the tradition, the belief system of these natives. They took it as their right over not just the geography, but also over the people. And as would any conqueror do, they settled down there. With time, these European and African settlers, they mingled with the Red Indians. And now, this created a new problem for them. The problem of how to determine the purity of blood. The word for which in Spanish and Portuguese is casta. The word that we now know in English as caste. They came up with a really stupid solution. They divided the people as per their color. Spanish father, Spanish mother, both whites, were placed at the top of this pyramid. An offspring of an African father, an African mother, both blacks, was placed at the bottom. Including these two were 16 castes that were created. Castes that were not known to the Red Indians, but now they had to live forever with these. This created a divide in the society because each caste would get social privileges as per their rank. This helped the Europeans establish white supremacy. But in the West, they had the same plan for the East. Now, what plans did they have for India, for Bharat? Before I move to that chapter, I request you all to like this video, share it, and once you watch it, please share your comments with me. Now, a word for all the regular listeners of Adisi. You must be wondering, why am I talking in English and why not in Hindi? The reason is simple. This concept of caste is something which is not at the grassroots levels in India. It has been brought down from the top, from the people who understand this language. For both the plotters and the ones who become victims to this plot. This language reaches out to all. And that is why I chose to talk in English when I chose to talk about the caste system. The story of Bharat, India for them, is rather unique in the world. When these Europeans, they entered India under the garb of trade, they were completely bewildered by the prowess of Indian science, medicine, mathematics, astrology, astronomy, architecture. They could not understand the diversity of the land and yet the amazing strength that we had in our unity. They couldn't understand the source of this unity. Now here we need to understand a few things. There are two kinds of thoughts that prevail in India. One says that we were amazing in our ancient times, but as we moved down the time and we reached the Middle Ages, all this knowledge was gone and that's how we became poor. The other thought says that we never had anything great and we should be thankful to the British. But the reality is much, much farther than these two. India had some amazing scientific discoveries, innovations, inventions, even in the 18th century. This requires another video and I will be doing that. But now let's come to the point. In the beginning, these Europeans could not understand a thing about India. Because for them, everything is about the physical features, the physical attributes, the cardinal factors of a population for the growth. Understanding these factors, they were able to dominate the rest of the world. But when they came to India, the story was completely different. Up north, around Kashmir, they would meet a man who would share the same tone of the skin as what they had. Now, how can this man be in India? He looks similar to us. When they moved to Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, they saw men who were taller, broader, and wider than these Europeans, who thought of themselves as supreme. How could this be? When they went down south, they saw the people were black in color, but they were not similar to the Africans. The British, the Europeans couldn't understand the common thread that connected all the diverse people together. And that is why they never could understand India as a nation. Because for them, a nation is something which is created by the people who look similar, who have similar tastes in food, in habits. But here in India, there was a wide range of people, all extremely different, yet connected. The Europeans couldn't understand one more thing. How could Indians be mentally brilliant? They have the knowledge of science, cosmology, as well as human anatomy, and at the same point in time be physically strong, have amazing weaponry. Because in the West, people were either strong or they had land, and so they would be higher in the strata, or later on they would have industries, mentally strong but physically not that strong, and then they rose to the prominence. Both didn't exist at the same time. But here in India, it was a whole complex system which Europeans failed to understand. Now, with this complexity, they had the problem of how to call themselves superior. How can we say that white supremacy has to prevail here? How can we do that? That is when they started reading Indian texts, science, mathematics, astronomy, astrology, architecture, as well as the religious texts. They realized that the power that India has is because of our knowledge of the Vedas. They read the Vedas, they read Upanishads, they read different scientific texts, and that is when they also realized that to have them call themselves as superior, they need to associate with this set of people who, according to them, were superior in some way than those who were down south. So that is when they created this concept of Indo-Greek ethnicity. They created this Indo-Greek connectivity, and they came up with this theory called the Aryan invasion theory. How do we associate ourselves with this superior race? How do we solidify this association? For that, they brought in a person called Max Muller. We all must have heard about him. This guy was a German, but for the larger part of his life, he stayed in Britain. The interesting part is that he never came to India. I'll repeat, Max Muller never came to India. Yet he studied all the texts. He studied Rigved, he studied Upanishads. How could this be? Yes, there were teachers in the West who would teach him Sanskrit. But still, how could he read Vedas when the Vedas originated in India? Which means that these British, these Portuguese, these Germans, they came to India and they looted, they plundered our texts. They took the original manuscripts to the West and the people studied there. One such person was Max Muller. Now this guy, he was filled with Christian supremacy, white supremacy, and his entire purpose of reading Vedas was to come up with some really weird notions. He came up with something called as the physical difference between the so-called Aryan race and the Dravidian race. Max Muller even said in one of his letters that India has been conquered once. We would do it again, but then this time it will be different. It has to be by attacking the education system that India has. The confidence that the people have, the trust that the people have in these texts called as Vedas. If we uproot this from the Indian soil, from the Indian culture, we would be able to dominate them. And that is exactly what was done by the followers of Max Muller. Now, with the advent of this new concept, the Aryan invasion theory, they also had to come up with certain proofs. They had to prove it so that they can tell this to the supreme race here in India and even across the world. So they came up with something called as the nasal index. There was this guy called as H. Risley. He came up with nasal index, wherein he measured the length and the breadth of the nose of different people to connect them together or to segregate them. They even came up with phrenology, the study of skull. You'll be surprised to know that these people were so much obsessed with the physical features that they not only measured head or the nose, they even went on to find some similarity or group Indians either through the color of their skin. They couldn't do that. They went on to segregate or bring together people according to the color of eyes, the color of hair. They couldn't find any common link, any algorithm through which they would be able to segregate, distinguish, group the people in India. Max Muller, along with many others who supported this theory of Aryan invasion, admitted they do not have any solid proof. They said that it is just a postulate, a hypothesis, which was later taken quite literally by the followers of Max Muller. One such person was H. Risley. This is the guy I just mentioned about. This is the guy who came up with the nasal index. And he went on to a great length to prove his point, which was quite weird. He did not have any particular commonality. He couldn't come up with any particular conclusions with his theory. Now comes a very interesting part, a part which the British could not understand then, and they would not be able to understand it even today. But the sad part is that as Indians, today, we are also the ones who would not be able to understand this concept. What is that? Let's talk about it. Now, the British face a rather peculiar problem here in India. In the West, when they conquered America, it did not take much time to actually conquer and loot and establish their white supremacy. But here in India, they had to face resistance from almost all the areas. It took a time longer than what they had expected, within which the idea of pure blood actually got diffused. So now how are we able to divide the masses? How are we able to rule over them? That is when they came up with census. In the early 19th century, around the first decade of 1800s, they conducted a survey. But this survey was not at all mathematical or statistical. It had no scientific methodology. It was just a data gathering initiative. Now, to understand the population of India, the population division, the segregation of Indian communities, so that they could divide them in certain segments and then establish their white supremacy, they committed huge blunders. For example, when they studied Banaras and the population of Banaras, they came up with a figure of around 5,82,000 being the population in Banaras in the early 19th century. But then the later surveys, which were better conducted, they came up with a figure of 1,52,000 as the population of Banaras. So you can understand the initial surveys which were conducted were blunders and they conveyed nothing. And yet, the data was taken not just by the British at that point in time. We Indians and our historians still take their data, which has no mathematical or statistical or methodological basis. It is interesting to understand the kind of concepts that they came up with to conduct these kind of surveys in the early 19th century. Firstly, they were not able to segregate houses from the shops which were there within the houses. They didn't understand whether it is one entity or two. Secondly, they came up with an arbitrary number of 7 being the number of family members within each household. So they counted the number of houses and they multiplied each household by 7. And that's how they came up with a figure, which made the population look quite huge within certain areas. They got really worried about it because the population suddenly swelled. So how are we able to come up with certain operations, certain schemes to rule over them? Now, while all these illogical things were getting conducted in India, in the West, they were trying to understand Indian sciences, Indian texts, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And they couldn't fathom the fact that these are pretty old texts. They have a certain antiquity which predates the biblical world. Because according to the biblical world, the world started at around 4004 BC. So how can anything predate that? And hence, anything that has been mentioned in the texts which predates the biblical context of the world is a myth. That is how all our stories, all our Purans, all our Veda and Upanishads, Ramayana and Mahabharata, they were called mythologies. As we entered into the later half of the 19th century, the British plot became sinister. The later half of 19th century saw a lot of surveys being conducted called census. Now, what they did here in India was something similar they did in Ireland to the Irish people, which was also conquered by them. In these two places, they came up with a census which recorded the caste of the people, the religion of the people, which they did not conduct in their own country, Britain. When the British failed miserably to bring any particular concept, any methodology through which they would have segregated Indians in different groups, which they would have then ranked, when their science failed in nasal index and phrenology, when their so-called statistics failed through the population survey, when they could not segregate or group Indians through color of hair, eyes, skin, or even language, they turned to caste. The British had no idea what they were getting themselves into. The Imperial Gazette of India is an official book which has the accounts of these census reports, which has the accounts of these surveyors who did talk about the issues they faced when they conducted these surveys, the census. Let us look at some of the important pointers from the original accounts. The British officials went on to find the caste of Indians. They were astonished by the fact that Indians did not know their caste. They did not adhere to any particular formula for that. Now, some of the problems that the British faced were as such. Caste was taken by different people as per their birth, occupation, land, migration, or just because they had more wealth, they changed their caste, which means there was no strict concept of caste in India. People could migrate from one caste to another caste. There were Kshatriyas in the west as well as in the east. This baffled the Europeans because they thought that because Kshatriyas are the warrior class, they had to be only in the west. But we had Kshatriyas in the east as well. According to them, the Brahmins were at the highest level, but there were many Brahmins who would serve the Kshatriyas, who would serve the service class people as well. There were Brahmins from the so-called lower castes as well. In India, we also had casteless tribes. Now, which category would these be put into? Also, the most astonishing fact was nobody identified themselves with the Shudras, which, according to the British and their interpretation, as per Max Muller, were at the lowest strata. But then in India, nobody associated themselves with the Shudras. In a survey of Bengal, it was found that there were only 8% Brahmins. So this breaks the myth that Brahmins have always enjoyed the social preferences. They have not. The final report of the survey mentioned more than 2,300 castes, a data which is mind-blowing. The people, the British officials, were really clueless as to what to be done with this data because it had so many irregularities. There were people, there were Brahmins from upper class, from lower class. There were Kshatriyas in the west and the east. There were Kshatriyas in the north and the south. There were people who changed their occupation and so they changed their castes. There were people who migrated and they changed their castes. There were people who made more money and so they changed their castes. There was no common pointer which they could identify with the concept called the caste. Now, what did the British do with this data? Did they come up with any statistical concept? No. Rather, they came up with a linear numbering pattern. They created 7 large categories from 1 to 7, and then they just pushed all the 2,300 castes within these 7 categories without any logic, without understanding that in India we never followed any caste. People chose certain occupation and they were called as per the occupation. If in the lineage anybody changed the occupation, they are called differently. There is no division whatsoever on the basis of birth or caste. Yet the British came up with such a formula, and then that is how the caste system got solidified. Another interesting thing is that when they talked about the Muslims in India, they had a very different notion. Take a look at this one. Another weird thing was that nowhere in the census report or the data or the analysis did they mention Gotra, because there could be one Gotra and under that there could be several surnames. These people could be considered socially privileged or not as per either their economic well-being or their occupation, but they all are a part of one family. And that is why we have the concept of marrying outside the Gotra. British did not consider this simple concept. Now, after all this discussion, I believe that we now have a clear understanding of who was behind the creation of the caste system. Why was it brought in? But still the question remains, why even after independence did we follow this particular concept? Was it just politics? Or are the forces that wanted to divide India still acting up?